Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit der Reich regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen. Die Frage, wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollen die, wenn nötig, totale und radikale, als wir uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können?
Early 1945 on Latvia's Baltic coast. For several months, the German Army Group North had been encircled by the Red Army on the Courland Peninsula. The immense human and material losses over the past years had left Nazi Germany's once dreaded army in a state of collapse. Amateur photographs reveal the sorry state of the trapped units. In contrast, Nazi propaganda was still clinging to the myth of military strength. A newsreel showed the swearing in of home defense units.
Diese Waffen werden Ihnen heute zu treuen Händen übergeben. Die Heimat schafft sie Ihnen in schwerer Arbeit auf unter Frontnahmebedingungen. So gehen Sie mit Freude und Eifer an Ihren Dienst, immer Ihre Pflichten vor Augen, damit Sie am Kampfe um die Erhaltung des Reiches die besten Grenadiere des Führers sind.
The newly established units, called Volksgrenadiers, were made up of local home guards, adolescents, and a scattering of regular soldiers. The men were required to swear an oath to the Führer, even though the military situation was already hopeless.
Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer des Großdeutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler, dem obersten Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht, unbedingten Gehorsam leisten und als tapferer Soldat bereit sein will, jederzeit für diesen Eid mein Leben einzusetzen.
Die Vorstellung ist ja eben,
it was about making an ultimate
ein Opfer zu
sacrifice,
bringen, ein
not giving
finales
up.
eben nicht
The idea of sacrificing oneself was
Idee
very
eines
strong,
Staates,
very
sich zu
important
opfern,
under National Socialism.
ist eben eine ganz
That's why
starke,
Hitler also
ganz,
thought the
ganz
Navy was so great, because they
Deswegen
went
fand
down with
Hitler
all
die
hands.
Kriegsmarine so toll, weil
That
die mit
impressed him.
anderen
He thought that was great. That's what you had to do.
So muss man das machen.
On the 12th of January 1945, the Red Army launched a major offensive in East Prussia. At 4:45 a.m., the sky turned as bright as day as up to 300 Soviet guns per kilometer along the front opened fire on the German positions. Red Army cameramen filmed the apocalyptic scenes as the Wehrmacht's lines of defense rapidly collapsed. Over the previous years, German forces had waged a campaign of destruction against the people of the Soviet Union, who Nazi ideology painted as racially inferior. Now the war on the East Front was shifting onto the territory of the Reich. Many Germans feared the Soviet Red Army would exact a terrible revenge.
Die Menschen haben einfach Angst. Denen hat man erzählt, da kommt
People
jetzt der
were
russische
simply
Untermensch.
afraid. They had been told that the
Sie haben Angst vor der
subhuman
Roten
Russians
Armee.
are coming, and they were afraid of the Red Army. But of course, they also knew about the atrocities the German forces had committed in the Soviet Union. That was known. To that extent, it was a mixture of prejudice against the Russian subhumans, a realistic assessment that the Red Army would not be squeamish in its advance, and a clear recognition of the mass crimes that Germany had committed and a fear of vengeance.
Many of the roughly 2.5 million people living in East Prussia at the time wanted to flee their homes as fast as possible and head west. But most of them couldn't.
Die Nationalsozialisten haben lange die Flucht verboten. Man wollte, dass
For a
sie die
long
Stellung
time, the Nazis had
halten
forbidden people
und
to
somit
flee.
den Anrücken
They wanted them to
der
stay
Anrücken
put
der
and oppose the
Sowjetarmee
advancing
etwas
Soviet army.
entgegensetzen können.
This was certainly one
Das
reason
hat
why the
sicherlich
escape
dazu
was later so
beigetragen, dass
chaotic
die
and
Flucht dann
violent.
nachher so chaotisch und,
People didn't
gewaltsam
leave until the last
abgelaufen
minute.
ist. Die Leute sind
They could
in
only
letzter
take the bare
Minute
necessities
gegangen.
with them,
Sie sind mit
and they'd been
notdürftig
worn down by the
zusammengepackt
war.
Gepäck gegangen Und sie sind eben oft genug im Kriegsgeschehen aufgerieben worden.
Wer flieht da auf diesen Treks? Mütter
Who
und
went
ihre
on these
Kinder.
treks? Mothers and their children and old men. As always in war, the weakest get hit the hardest. They were left to fend for themselves and also made to suffer for the failure of an entire nation, including the lack of evacuation plans.
Inklusive der nicht existenten Evakuierungsplanung zur Verantwortung gezogen werden.
Because the Soviet forces had largely blocked the road to the west, many people tried to flee across the frozen lagoon. But coastal waters could be every bit as dangerous. Many were aiming for the Baltic coast near Danzig, from where they hoped they'd be able to continue their escape by ship. Ports like Gotenhafen, today's Gdynia, were still under German control. That's where the Wilhelm Gustloff was moored, waiting to take on refugees and soldiers. Named after a senior Swiss Nazi assassinated in 1936, the cruise ship was famous in Germany. Adolf Hitler had personally attended its 1937 launch in Hamburg.
Ich taufe dich auf den Namen Wilhelm Gustloff.
For years, the ship served as a holiday vessel for the Nazi organization Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy. Party members would relax on its decks as it cruised the Mediterranean or the North Sea. Now it was supposed to transport evacuated refugees and soldiers westwards. Thousands of people were crammed together on board as it set sail, and this overloading proved fatal. To avoid running aground in shallow waters, the captain set course far out into the Baltic Sea, where the Soviet Navy was also operating. The ship was detected and torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. At least 9,300 people died in the sinking.
Legally, it was not a war crime at all because the Gustloff was sailing without lights in a conflict zone and was armed and carrying soldiers. So in a sense, if you look at the laws of war, the attack on the Gustloff was legal. Whether it was legitimate is another question. You can decide for yourself.
On the other side of the globe, the war was continuing unabated. The US Navy was cruising off the strategically important Japanese island of Iwo Jima, about 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo. In mid-February 1945, battleships opened fire on the island, which is only 21 square kilometers in size. They had air support from US bombers based in the Mariana Islands.
Die Vulkaninsel Iwo Jima.
The volcanic island of Iwo Jima was operationally important because it had air bases that could be used to escort bombers or as an emergency landing site for them. So they set their sights on Iwo Jima.
In den Fokus.
Cameramen from the US Office of War Information filmed as several tens of thousands of US Marines landed on the island shortly before 9 in the morning, 3 days after the attack had begun. Their footage of the fierce fighting over the so-called Sulphur Island would later form the basis of the documentary war film To the Shores of Iwo Jima.
We run into trouble on Green Beach. From their fortified positions on Mount Suribachi, the Japs look right down our throats.
Besides the cameramen, there were also photographers among the war correspondents. On the 23rd of February, a few days after the start of the landing operation, one of them snapped US Marines raising the stars and stripes on the summit of the extinct Suribachi volcano. Although the men were actually replacing the flag raised earlier that day, the photo was to go down in history.
The Second World War was also a war of images and symbols. Out of the millions of photos we have from World War II, there are 5 or 6 that we all know. The hoisting of the flag on Iwo Jima, the reenacted one, symbolizes the American victory in the Pacific.
But it would be several months before the Americans could really claim victory in the Pacific. The fighting around Iwo Jima alone continued for weeks after the picture at the volcano summit was taken. the Japanese defenders resorted to a particularly bloody tactic.
Dem Kommandierenden ist
The
völlig klar,
Japanese
dass
commander was fully aware that he could not defend the island against the Americans. The point was to inflict the highest possible number of losses on the Americans so that the war would become unpopular and would be stopped for political reasons. That didn't work, but still the number of American deaths was huge.
Die Amerikaner dort zu beklagen haben, immens.
More than 6,800 US Marines were killed taking the island, and almost 20,000 US servicemen were wounded. On the Japanese side, most of the 20,000 or so defenders lost their lives. Only 216 men surrendered to the enemy.
The Americans were shocked by the Japanese willingness to sacrifice themselves, which was evident during the defense of Iwo Jima. The Americans hadn't really believed that the Japanese would fight quite so tenaciously to the last. That played a very big role in the fact that at some point the Americans changed their minds and said, "We have to find another way to end the war."
The forces of the Japanese Empire weren't just fighting doggedly against imminent defeat on Iwo Jima. Since October 1944, their commanders had also been relying on a new tactic in the Pacific, kamikaze flights, where pilots flew their planes directly into enemy warships, usually killing themselves in the process. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the Japanese Naval Air Force, had developed the idea.
The American soldiers, of course, found this completely shocking. They hadn't expected anything like that. It was a completely new form of warfare. And the American side hadn't reckoned with such a willingness to make sacrifices.
The squadrons of these flying bombs bore names like Morning Sun and Mountain Cherry Blossom. It wasn't difficult to recruit fanatical youngsters to the suicide squads.
If you look at the results, though, you have to say these attacks weren't very efficient. They didn't really do much good at all. The Americans shot down a lot of those planes before they could even reach their targets, and even those that did hit them often didn't have much effect. It was more a shock element.
Images like this also contributed to the shock. Footage taken on the 21st of January 1945 showed the consequences of a kamikaze attack on the USS Ticonderoga near the Straits of Formosa. Although the aircraft carrier survived the attack, more than 100 men on board didn't, and the death toll of American troops in the Pacific climbed further. Less than 2 weeks later, a summit in the Soviet seaside resort of Yalta brought together the big three Allied leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition. For some years, Britain, the Soviet Union and the United States had been united against the Nazis. Now, as their forces moved into Germany itself, the end of the war in Europe seemed only a matter of time. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt focused on concrete planning for the post-war future they'd sketched out at the Tehran summit more than a year earlier.
In Yalta sind die großen
When the big three met at Yalta, the first issue was the westward shift of Poland. They'd already discussed that at Tehran. Now it was decision time, and it was clear that there would be occupation zones. Then they talked about what to do in the Pacific.
So far, the Soviet Union had not participated in the fighting in the Pacific. But Roosevelt's health was declining, and he wanted to bring Moscow on side to end the war quickly and avoid further heavy losses.
Roosevelt approached Stalin and told him that he needed him in the Pacific. He negotiated with him and got him to promise that the Red Army would attack Japan 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. And Stalin kept that promise to the day.
In return, the Western Allies pledged to expand their support for the Red Army by bombing the German Reich. 2 days after the summit, they trained their sights on the city of Dresden. On the 13th of February 1945, some 800 British Lancaster bombers took off for what was then Germany's 7th largest city, which had previously been largely spared airstrikes.
In dieser Situation galt es für
Churchill wanted something to show Stalin that they supported the Soviets. And so the idea took root that if they flew air raids behind the German lines on the Soviet front and caused chaos there, it would somehow help the Red Army.
The British planes reached Dresden just before 10:30 in the evening. An automatic camera filmed the explosive and incendiary bombs dropping from the air. The attackers made no attempt to hit specific targets. Large areas of the city were to be destroyed. Within 15 minutes, 3/4 of the city center was on fire.
The fact that the attack on Dresden was so devastating had to do with the circumstances. Dresden had no anti-aircraft defenses. Its anti-aircraft guns had been taken to the Eastern Front, and many of its night fighters couldn't take off. It was a clear night, no defenses, and the British could go in relatively low. The Pathfinder could drop its flares accurately, and the bombers were able to follow them exactly. So it was a textbook attack.
A few hours later, on Valentine's Day 1945, American bombers attacked Dresden again, this time in daylight. The US News reported,
"The veteran 1st Division of the 8th Air Force today carried its 200,000 ton of bombs to help an ally. Now they hit Dresden, hardest of all."
The important transport hub on the Elbe River was hit by a total of 4 waves of attacks.
The Blitz here, blasting away for the Russians now 45 miles away, links the two-front Allied drive from east and west on Berlin.
The Anglo-American airstrikes devastated the city and killed up to 25,000 people. "I could never have believed," said an officer of the Dresden Missing Persons Center, "that death could overtake people in so many different ways. Burnt, charred, dismembered, apparently sleeping peacefully, distorted by pain, completely curled up, dressed, naked, or as a miserable heap of ashes. And above all this, the pungent smoke and the unbearable smell of decay." Pictures taken months after the attacks still give an impression of the extent of the catastrophe. On the Western Front, the Wehrmacht was now being pushed further onto the defensive. The Allies had occupied Aachen, the first major German city to be liberated in the previous autumn. The surprise German offensive in the Battle of the Bulge in December had slowed down the US-British advance, and it would be another month before the Americans could start moving east again. Just over the border in Jülich, they met with fierce resistance. A German newsreel reported,
"Bei Jülich gehen deutsche Eingreifreserven zum Gegenstoß über. Wo der Gegner angreift, stößt er auf den verbissenen Widerstand unserer Grenadiere und Fallschirmjäger."
The German defenders blew up the nearby Ruhr Dam, so the river levels rose noticeably. The US forces had to wait until the floods had subsided before they could cross the river on the 23rd of February and enter the center of Jülich. The GIs encountered a shocking picture. Jülich no longer existed. The town had been under fire for months, and countless artillery shells and bombs had rained down on it. The last inhabitants had been evacuated in December of the previous year. What remained was a field of rubble where the German defenders had dug in and were fighting a pointless and bitter battle in the ruins against the American occupiers. At the beginning of March, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, came to look at Jülich for himself. One of the places he visited was the historic citadel. For a long time, it had been considered impregnable, and no enemy soldier had entered it since the Napoleonic Wars. The footage shot here with Eisenhower was intended to send a clear signal that the entire German Reich could be conquered like the centuries-old fortress. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army continued to advance steadily. In addition to East Prussia in the north, it was also sweeping further south into Silesia, a region in present-day Poland that was of great strategic importance because of its industrial base. "Our tanks ran everything down," a Red Army soldier wrote in his diary on the 23rd of January. "Their tracks flattened vehicles, horses, and anything else on the road." The reasons for the Red Army's success lay in its superiority in both men and materiel, as well as serious tactical mistakes made by Hitler that no one had called into question for years.
Since November 1943, Hitler had been putting his priorities on the West. A lot was going wrong there in June, July, and August 1944, but he stuck to his vision. He said, "I have to give these Western allies who kicked us out of France another major blow now." So at a time when the Red Army was mounting one of the biggest offensives ever on the Vistula, he was focusing on the West, and so turning himself into Stalin's best ally.
In those years, many Germans had fled to Silesia to escape from the Western Allies' bombing. Silesia had been largely spared from aerial bombardment, but now the Soviet advance put them right in the middle of the war. Like in East Prussia, most people here only had one goal: to escape from the Red Army.
Die Rache wird fürchterlich sein.
The revenge will be terrible, because what we did during the Eastern Campaign, especially against Soviet civilians, but also in Poland, the crimes we committed will return to us as vengeance.
Those fears often proved to be justified. Many Red Army soldiers committed atrocities in revenge for the crimes of the Wehrmacht and the SS.
Wir haben hier eine Gewalteskalation.
We see an escalation of violence against the German civilian population. The shooting of civilians, the shooting of women and children.
Durch das Erschießen von Frauen und Kindern.
The abduction of German civilians.
Von deutschen Zivilisten.
And the mass rape of women.
Die Massenvergewaltigung von Frauen.
Die sexuelle Gewalt an deutschen Frauen.
The sexual violence against German women can be explained by various factors. On the one hand, it is said that a woman's body is symbolic of the nation, which means that any desecration, to use the term from that time, any desecration or dishonor through sexual violence, therefore also means the desecration or dishonor of the entire nation.
Nazi propaganda regularly focused on these desecrations and so continued to fuel the climate of fear and hatred among the population. This is a newsreel from January 1945.
In diesen von deutschen Truppen wiedereroberten Orten ist jedes Haus von den Grausamkeiten bolschewistischer Soldateska gezeichnet. Die Bestialitäten sind zu ungeheuerlich, als dass alles gezeigt werden könnte, was die Kamera festhielt. Qualvolles Entsetzen steht noch in den Gesichtern dieser deutschen Frauen. Sie berichten von den Tagen namenlosen Grauens, in denen sie wehrlos den verzierten Horden ausgeliefert waren. In unersättlicher Gier durchsuchte und beraubte die sowjetische Soldateska die Wohnungen.
Despite the hopelessness of the situation, military capitulation remained a taboo for the Nazi leadership. Instead, strategically outdated concepts were constantly advanced to stop the Red Army.
The question for the Germans was how to stop this Red Army onslaught. They hit on a concept that had been developed in 1944 on the Eastern Front to set up fixed points at transport hubs that would later be declared fortresses. These points would be defended and so act like breakwaters against which the Red Army's attacks would break.
Breslau in Lower Silesia, today's Wrocław in Poland, was one of the breakwaters chosen to stop the Russian advance.
Der ununterbrochene Ansturm des bolschewistischen Gegners auf die Festung Breslau scheitert immer wieder an dem eisernen Abwehrwillen ihrer Verteidiger. Der Führer Niederschlesiens, Gauleiter Hanke, der die Besatzung und die Bevölkerung Breslaus mit einem fanatischen Widerstandsgeist beseelt hat. Männer und Frauen greifen mit zu, um die Stadt ständig verteidigungsbereit zu halten.
On the 20th of January, Karl Hanke, the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, ordered the civilian population to leave the city. However, due to a lack of organization and fear of the dangers, 200,000 people remained. Military untrained civilians were to join units of the Volkssturm, Wehrmacht and SS to defend the city. Anyone who refused would be shot.
This led
to some absurd measures. Runways were built inside the city, and people tried to defend it in a kind of urban warfare that massively raised the death toll among the German civilian population.
On other sections of the front, while Breslau was still under siege, the Red Army was advancing to the Oder River, building bridgeheads on the west bank near Küstrin. Nevertheless, the Nazi leadership appeared unimpressed. In the middle of the month, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "As for the East, the Führer is no longer too concerned. He has the impression that we have slowly regained a firm footing." While the Red Army was conquering large parts of Silesia and Pomerania in the east, the Americans, British and Canadians were making rather slow progress in the west. Their next big objective was the Rhine River. Since the end of February, US forces had been fighting their way towards Cologne.
The Rhine was the big natural border in the west, and the fighting on its approaches was heavy and losses relatively high. February 1945 was one of the worst months for the U.S. Army in terms of casualties.
On March the 5th, American units reached the suburbs of Cologne. The 3rd U.S. Armored Division entered through the western districts. The ordinary citizen of Cologne has nothing to fear from the Allied troops, said leaflets that had been dropped over the city earlier. A day later, as GIs were fighting their way into the city center, they encountered a young woman who had apparently got caught in her car between the lines. She was seriously injured, but they were able to rescue her. A few hundred meters away, the Americans encountered a last German resistance nest near the cathedral. A Panther tank was blocking the way to the Rhine, but even that couldn't hold off the offensive for long, and it was taken out with a targeted hit. Only 3 of the 5-man crew escaped from the burning wreck. The last significant resistance had been broken. By late afternoon on the 6th of March, fighting had stopped. The Second World War was over in the city districts on the left bank of the Rhine. The next day, the Wehrmacht High Command noted merely the heap of rubble that was Cologne was left to the enemy. The US military, however, reported in more detail.
Cologne was a major German city, and by far the largest city that the Allies had conquered by then. Hamburg, Leipzig, Berlin, Munich were still far away. So it made sense to document the taking of Cologne with its iconic cathedral in the western part of the Reich more broadly than, say, the conquest of the town of Wesel.
Cameramen from the US Army Air Forces accompanied the advancing troops as part of Special Film Project 186 and captured the massive destruction on 16mm color film. Their footage paints an impressive picture of Cologne, nearly 3/4 of which had been destroyed. The US High Command attached great importance to the film work.
Film played a major role in the Second World War, not only for documentary purposes, but also for propaganda. They had portable and practical camera technology, and they used color film. The Americans filmed in color, of course. So you could take your impressions home with you, to document them for the cinemas on the one hand, but also for internal use in the military.
Before they were crushed, Cologne's defenders had managed to blow up the bridges over the Rhine, which meant the Allies would not be able to cross the river for the time being. Then, just a day after the conquest of downtown Cologne, the Americans pulled off another military coup about 55 kilometers upstream. A small advance patrol from the US 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge, which spans the Rhine at Remagen. To their great surprise, the structure had not been blown up, and there was little resistance from enemy troops.
The Remagen Volkssturm Battalion did not turn up. If they had been there and done a bit of shooting, then this small patrol, there weren't many American soldiers, would not have been able to reach the bridgehead and the bridge approaches so easily.
The bridge was captured in a surprise attack. The action was reenacted for propaganda units a few days later. More than 8,000 US soldiers were to reach the eastern bank of the Rhine within the coming 24 hours. Wehrmacht units tried to correct their mistake and destroy the bridge with air attacks and artillery fire. However, it took 10 days for the structure to actually collapse. By then, US pioneers had built a pontoon bridge and could continue getting units across the Rhine on a large scale. It was a heavy blow for the defenders, and those responsible suffered the consequences.
Hitler
was furious, and he had the bridge commander executed, along with some others they could get a hold of, 3 or 4 people. They were court-martialed, convicted, and murdered, I would say.
The dictator had stopped appearing in public. On the 20th of March, Hitler had himself filmed one last time in the garden of his chancellery.
Did Hitler realize that the war was lost? And if so, when did he realize it? One argument is that Hitler was, of course, not stupid and had soon realized how bad the situation was. But this led him to withdraw more and more, and he only dared to face the public when he could announce a victory. And as these new victories were not forthcoming, Hitler became more and more depressed, and physical decay set in. Of course, it was clear to him how all this was going to end.
On that day, he gave medals to members of the Hitler Youth who had distinguished themselves in the fighting. The fact that the war was lost didn't absolve Germans from their duty to defend their homeland. The younger generation in particular was swept up by this inhuman fanaticism.
Young people were the Third Reich's final reserves, especially in this last phase of the war in 44-45. They were the last reserves, each and every one of them, a disposable mass to be used as cannon fodder, as fuel for the final battle.
Ich war bei unserem ersten Angriff als Befehl des Bandführers als Melder eingesetzt. Ich musste eine sehr wichtige Meldung zu den Sturmgeschützen zurückbringen und diese heranziehen. Diese kamen dann auch nach und so ermöglichten sie uns das Eindringen in das vom Feind besetzte Dorf und so hoben wir die Bereitstellung auf.
Als der Russe näher an Lauban heranrückte, habe ich mich dem Kampfkommandanten von Lauban freiwillig als Melder zur Verfügung gestellt. Meine Aufgabe bestand darin, Meldungen zu den einzelnen Kompaniegefechtsständen zu bringen. Außerdem habe ich oftmals Panzerfäuste und Verpflegung in die Hauptkampflinie geschafft.
The Lower Silesian town of Lubanie, in present-day Poland, had been taken over by the Red Army in February 1945. At the beginning of March, however, the Wehrmacht recaptured it, one of the rare German success stories of those days. Propaganda Minister Josef Goebbels immediately went there and shortly afterwards gave a fanatical speech in nearby Görlitz. It was to be his last appearance on newsreel.
Jene Divisionen, die jetzt schon zu kleinen Offensiven angetreten sind,
und in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu Großoffensiven antreten werden, werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändeten Frauen vor Augen und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird.
Goebbels in particular is, to put it cynically, at his best here. He gives this speech where he says, "Then they will go into this fight like into a church service." This is a kind of staging of the downfall and also a permanent staging of the will. We will definitely not survive it. That's it, actually. They keep talking about the turning point, about victory, but the underlying motif of the manipulators is actually Nazi ideology or nothing.
In January, Goebbels had announced a campaign called the People's Sacrifice for the Army and Home Guard, as in the Napoleonic Wars, the population was urged to donate towards its own defense.
Grenadiere und Volkssturmmänner brauchen Bekleidung und Ausrüstung. Das Volksopfer wird sie ihnen geben. Was Schränke und Schubladen an nicht unbedingt nötigen bergen, bringt es in die Sammelstellen. Es ist für unsere Soldaten und Volkssturmmänner und damit für euch.
Faced with the threat of collapse, the regime was desperately trying to compensate for its huge losses, pulling women into the fight.
Panzerfaustschießen in einer deutschen Stadt. Hier kann jeder Deutsche die Handhabung dieses vom Feind gefürchteten Panzernahbekämpfungsmittels kennenlernen. Es ist genauso einfach, wie es aussieht.
Another brutal thing was that the range of these Panzerfausts was at maximum 100 meters, usually 50 or 60 to be really effective. But then those who fired them always paid with their lives. That was the regime's cynical calculation. One local defense volunteer killed, one enemy tank destroyed.
The area still under German control was shrinking day by day. The Nazi leaders now ordered their people to sacrifice not only clothes and iron, but also themselves.
Das ist ein Indiz für die Hemmungslosigkeit.
It was an indication of the regime's lack of restraint and its brute will to destroy everything. In the end, it was ready to open all the floodgates, to throw off every form of responsibility, and to do everything in its power to continue this war, as hopeless as it was, to carry on with it, right down to the last bullet.
In the Pacific War, on the 9th of March, US B-29 Superfortress planes were loaded with bombs on Saipan, the main island of the Northern Marianas. The destination of the long-range bombers was the Japanese capital. The mission commander, Major General Curtis E. LeMay, had decided on a radical change of tactics. As part of Operation Meeting House, Tokyo was to be attacked not only with explosives, but also with incendiary bombs. These were also to be dropped over residential areas. An armada of bombers took off from the three island airfields in the afternoon of the 9th of March. Each of the more than 300 aircraft was carrying 40 cluster bombs with a total of 1,500 napalm bomblets. The GIs nicknamed them Tokyo calling cards. There are no known original photographs of the attack. Scenes filmed later showed the Superfortress bombers dropping their deadly loads. More than 1,600 tons of bombs were released over the city at low altitude. Japanese houses were mostly made of wood and paper and immediately went up in flames. Strong westerly winds fanned the flames into a firestorm. Up to 100,000 people died during the attack, and over 40 square kilometers of the city were destroyed. It's still seen as the most destructive conventional airstrike in history.
Damit wollte man dem japanischen Kriegsgegner ganz
The
klar
intention was to send a clear message to all of the Japanese that they were now in danger.
Die japanische Kriegspropaganda hat eben ganz
And the Japanese war propaganda whipped up the will of Japanese soldiers to go on fighting to their deaths.
Wirklich bis in den Tod zu gehen.
The fanatical determination of the Japanese was once again evident on Okinawa, the smallest of Japan's 5 main islands. The US invasion of Okinawa began on the 1st of April, when 180,000 troops moved into position around the island and began to land. At first they were met with little resistance, but the defenders had retreated into the interior, where they put up a frenzied fight.
Wenn wir an die Schlacht um Okinawa denken, hier haben sich
When we think of the Battle of Okinawa, there were a lot of civilians dug in the caves. And Japanese Americans were used to deliver the message in Japanese. Come out of the caves. Surrender. There is no sense in killing yourselves or waiting to die by flamethrowers or hand grenades.
By no means everyone was ready to give up. Teachers plunged to their deaths from cliffs, taking their pupils with them, all to escape life under American occupation. It took months before Okinawa was completely under US control. On the 12th of April 1945, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt died at the age of 63. Throngs of Americans turned out to watch his funeral procession pass through the streets of Washington and bid farewell to their wartime leader. Vice President Harry S. Truman took over the reins. In Berlin, the news caused a sensation. "Here is the miracle I always predicted," Hitler reportedly shouted when he heard of Roosevelt's death. Now who's right? The war is not lost.